everyone, and welcome to this video focusing on African American civil rights during the Gilded Age, 1877 to 1896. The Gilded Age was a period of industrialization, particularly with the new railroads. This also was a period of suppression of black civil rights in the South. One method of suppression which was strong throughout the period was disenfranchisement. This is preventing African Americans from voting. This was through various methods, such as literacy tests, where they'd be asked random, quite difficult questions which they wouldn't be able to answer, poll taxes, where they'd have to pay extortionate amounts of money just to vote, and the grandfather clause, where you had to prove that your grandfather had been born in America, but since many were brought there by slavery, they could not prove that. An example of the devastating effect of all of these preventions was in South Carolina, where 60% of the population was African American, but less than 1% of them could actually vote. Violence and intimidation was also a huge part of suppressing black civil rights, particularly lynching, which is where a white mob would murder a black person without a trial. At the peak of lynching in 1890s, there were at least 2 lynchings a week. And often it was claimed that they were protecting the white women from the sexual assault of African American men, and that was the reason that lynchings were justified. However, the real reason was just to uphold white supremacy, as research by Ida B. Wells found that in 2/3 of lynchings, sexual assault wasn't even alleged, let alone proved. Segregation also suppressed black civil rights. The 1896 Supreme Court case of Plessy v. Ferguson said that segregation was legal and constitutional as long as they are separate but equal facilities. This legitimized racial segregation across America, as long as it was separate but equal. This, however, was never the case, as African Americans always had inferior access to public facilities. It's arguable that African Americans did sort of benefit from segregation in that it created a need for black doctors and teachers and ministers. So this allowed the creation of a black middle class and positive black role models and a self-sufficient black society. The most obvious suppression of black civil rights during the Gilded Age was the continuation of slavery in all but name. Sharecropping meant that they were constantly in debt to the landlords that they worked for, and financial records would be manipulated so that they could never escape work as they were always in debt to them. Peonage was another form of debt slavery where they were tied to the landlords until the debt was paid, but the debt would be prolonged and, again, faked so that they could not leave. Sharecropping and convict leasing continued slavery in all but name. However, it's arguable that it was worse than slavery, because at least slaves had economic value as they were property, whereas convicts could be worked to death with no repercussions as they were expendable and had no economic value. Whenever labor was required, there would be sweep arrests of African Americans across the towns, of men and children, as up to 1/3 of the inmates involved in convict leasing were boys under the age of 16. There was also a mass migration of African Americans from the South to the North. For example, in 1879, 40,000 African Americans migrated north, and this split up many families and caused a lot of social problems. There were some good things to come out of the Gilded Age. For example, Tuskegee College in Alabama was a black school that was headed by the civil rights leader Booker T. Washington, and this allowed the creation of the black middle class. 7 black universities were also founded, and the emergence of this middle class meant that there were many African Americans who were more educated and more assertive about their civil rights. Also, due to segregation and the whites' refusal to be associated with any sort of African American, communities and towns of purely African American people emerged and were very prosperous and self-sufficient.